The Belvedere Refuge by C. L. Brasch. The Belvedere Theater was the grand old lady of North Charlotte. She opened her doors with much fanfare in 1950 to a large number of adults. By the autumn of 1965, however, her clientele was mostly flinty young boys from North Charlotte. North Charlotte was the other side of the railroad tracks in the 1960s, and the kids there all dreamed of getting to the right side of the tracks someday. Mr. Skip was ideally suited to help them dream. He was the projectionist at the Belvedere. He manned the concession stands at the theater. He took your ticket before the movie started. He even picked out the coming attractions. In truth, he tried to pick them out. Mr. Skip grew up during the Great Depression. As a lad, he tried hard to escape his family's North Carolina tenant farmer roots. His escape was in the late 1920s air-conditioned comfort of Charlotte's Carolina Theater Movie Palace. There, ushered to his seat by smartly dressed staff, he could marvel at the 8-rank Wurlitzer organ. He listened as the organist merrily accompanied Ronald Colman, defending Fort Zinderneuf and Douglas Fairbanks, swashbuckling through Sherwood Forest. The silent movies were anything but silent. When the talkies came of age in the 1930s and 1940s, Mr. Skip had his catcher's mitt wide open. He thrilled every Saturday matinee to screen gems such as Ronald Colman's The Prisoner of Zenda, Sam Jaffe's Gunga Din, and Humphrey Bogart's Casablanca. These classics were the movies Mr. Skip would have much preferred to pick for the North Charlotte rowdies, but the Belvedere's budget and her boys would have none of that. They were die-hard fans of Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Dale Evans, and Trigger, Sky King, Atragon, Fireball, XL5, and especially Godzilla. Mr. Skip excelled at tying together 3 movie matinees each Saturday afternoon for his kids. Champ, the Strawberry Roan, might kick off a Gene Autry and Pat Buttram adventure-filled Saturday for the guys. Jack Lemmon and Carol Lindley's Under the Yum Yum Tree would start off an occasional Comedy Fest matinee for the girls, and the guys with the goo-goo eyes for Carol Lindley. Mr. Skip relived his childhood each weekend as he smiled at his boys and girls. They were just as enchanted by the silver screen as he had been years ago. He did swallow hard on the Godzilla Saturdays. Still, he realized that his boys saw the original big guy as larger than life, Tokyo, or even North Charlotte. Consequently, the young lads would shell out their silver quarters for 3 Godzilla movies any Saturday that he appeared. A quarter was real money in 1965, and Mr. Skip offered a real deal that fall to the Beechwood Acres bunch, Godzilla's biggest fans. Beechwood Acres started out life as an affordable neighborhood for World War II veterans and their young families in the early 1950s. However, with the coming of Interstate 85 and its noisy construction, the once desirable community was progressively hemmed in by traffic and congestion. The Beechwood Acres children were dreamers, and they dreamed of a life out of earshot of I-85. In their active imaginations, Mr. Skip and the Belvedere were worlds removed from their ever-present interstate. The neighborhood boys loved seeing Godzilla, and his size 879 feet makes short work of Tokyo's highways, harboring a secret desire to see I-85 in its endless concrete expanse in similar fashion. Young tow-headed Davy and his older brother Chaz held I-85 in particularly low esteem. Before it was built, they had an unfettered run of creeks, forests, honeysuckle vine forts, and rope swings hung from suitable trees. I-85 cut their pastoral paradise neatly in half. It destroyed trees and tree houses that took the brothers years to climb and build. Mr. Skip knew of their disdain and their desire to be somewhere else, anywhere else, that October of 1965. Thus, one Gene Autry Saturday, during intermission at the concession stand, Mr. Skip gently pulled aside Davy and Chaz as they happily munched on popcorn and chocolate. Davy and Chaz were glad to listen to Mr. Skip. He was the only person they knew in North Charlotte who used real butter in his movie house popcorn. "Boys, I have a big surprise for you. Who is the king of the dinosaurs?" The boys stood fast at attention and exclaimed in unison, "Godzilla!" That's right, and he is coming here next weekend on the big screen to battle a 3-headed dinosaur with lightning breath. Mr. Skip smiled deeply and genuinely as he saw the boys' eyes dance with excitement and anticipation. At 2:45 movies, the Belvedere could only afford to show second-run films. Mr. Skip had wanted so badly for so long to show his kids just one first-run film. He had scrimped and saved for over a decade, and he finally had the necessary funds. Ghidra, the 3-headed monster, would make its Charlotte debut at the Belvedere, his grand old lady. One reason Mr. Skip alerted the boys a week early was to allow them plenty of time to earn a quarter apiece for admission. However, for once they were well prepared. Davy breathlessly spoke. "Mr. Skip, Chaz and I already have our quarters ready for next Saturday. We worked last weekend at Grandpa Jake's golf station. We earned 25 cents each for picking green beans." More accurately, Chaz worked picking beans while Davy slid along the garden rows on his backside, picking a bean, eating a bean, picking a bean, etc. Grandpa Jake was still more than happy to give Davy and Chaz a quarter because it was worth that much to him for the boys to stay out of trouble for an entire weekend. Earlier that summer in Whispering Pines, about 35 miles east of Charlotte, Davy had used Gulf No-Nox 104-octane gasoline as charcoal lighter fluid. He very nearly blew up Grandpa Jake along with his house, shed, garage, car, wife, and chicken coop. If truth be told, Davy was into mischief more than he was out. Back at the Belvedere, Davy and Chaz were so excited about the upcoming creature feature that they could not contain themselves. They had to burn off some chocolate-induced energy. Thus, waving goodbye to Mr. Skip after the Western matinee, they headed off in search of a good rope swing that needed to be swung. Chaz knew of a brand new one, attached to the I-85 railroad overpass, only a couple miles from the Belvedere. The brothers raced each other up the entire way. Once there, they scrambled up the steep Carolina red dirt embankment above the railroad tracks. The prize, a new rope knotted to an overpass I-beam, was waiting at the top. Jumping off the top of an overpass embankment while holding onto a rope swing is an art of practice. If you let go at any point of the arc, you fall onto the sharp slope and roll down pell-mell onto the gravel bed and hard steel tracks. Being 9 and 11, Davy and Chaz certainly had accrued a fair amount of rope practice at various swings in North Charlotte, but this was the first time anyone would be trying out the new rope under the high overpass. It all started out well as Davy perfectly timed his takeoff. The end came quickly, however, as Chaz surprised Davy by jumping onto the rope. Davy did not even have time to scream at his older brother. They simultaneously heard the sickening snap of overstretched rope. The boys almost instantly hit the dirt embankment at an abrupt angle. They rolled end over end in a confused ball of red dust toward the tracks. And that is when things really went downhill. As bad luck would have it, a Southern Railway freight train was making its North Charlotte run and was coming up on the I-85 overpass. The engineer looked out his window just in time to see Davy and Chaz tumbling towards the tracks and his train. His mouth opened wide as he instinctively let off the engine throttle. He knew those bristlehead varmints. Just a month earlier, they had patiently placed a dozen or more gravel rocks neatly on each track under that very same overpass. The boys had been conducting a science experiment to see if trains have shock absorbers. They don't. When the engineer's train hit those experimental gravel rocks, he was rudely thrown to the floor of his compartment. The stones exploded in all directions. The train nearly derailed as the engineer locked up on all brakes. When he got up and came somewhat to his senses, he saw two boys run away as fast as they could. Experiment successfully concluded. As the train finally shuddered and rocked to a crunchy stop, the engineer jumped out and set off in hot pursuit. Fortunately for the boys, they made it home and hid well under Davy's bed before the panting engineer could spot them. Their mom came home from grocery shopping at the A&P just then. She found the boys hiding and got down on all fours. She asked them why were they under the bed, what were they up to, and why was a man in cap and overalls running down their street screaming about the youth of today. Back at the overpass, the throttled freight train and its hapless engineer sped by the boys on rock-free rails this time. He never even saw the train because he was madder than a wet hornet. "Chaz, what was all that about? You snapped a brand new rope and you nearly killed us. Now we have to find a new rope and crawl out on the I-beam to reattach it. You know the neighborhood rules. You swing it, you string it. And you were too big to fit on that I-beam width. I'll be the one who has to slid it out there with rope in hand." Chaz really felt awful, and not just from his nausea. He quickly reasoned there was only one card he could play before his kid brother thrashed him. I apologize, Davy, but I am going to make it up to you. Honest." He looked Davy straight in the eye, and he solemnly intoned, "I will do the creek of death, this afternoon, now." Davy quit spinning and stared at his disheveled brother in shocked disbelief. Chaz was the last of the Beechwood Acres bunch to be initiated into the Creek of Death fraternity. The neighborhood boys were actually starting to wonder if Chaz was chicken. He wasn't chicken, he was smart. The I-85 road construction had somehow missed the Creek of Death. Most of his bank was so entirely engulfed in briars and brambles that a skinny rabbit couldn't get through there. The creek bed itself was strewn with so many razor-sharp stones, even the fish stayed clear. Between the bank and the bed, the creek of death was as effective as any minefield. Right at the edge of the water, there was a foot-wide stretch of sand, the drop edge of yonder. That was a target drop area. A sweeping oak tree hung high over the bank and the creek. Sometime in distant ages past, some brave young soul had shimmied up the oak tree to attach a rope string. The free end of the rope was tied to the base of the tree. To be initiated, Chaz would need to jump barefoot off the edge of a cliff, hold tightly onto the rope, swing out over the water, and then let go of the rope on its return arc at precisely the right point. If Chaz let go too soon, he would hit the water and the stones, cutting his unprotected feet to ribbons. If he let go too late, he would drop feet first into the thick briar patch, slicing his entire body to ribbons. If he did not let go at all, Davy and the neighborhood boys would ostracize him forever. Under the overpass, Davy grabbed Chaz by the shoulder and said, "Come on, let's go." Only a couple dozen boys knew the hidden path to the Creek of Death, so Davy would have to show Chaz the way. The path lay just a few feet from the Stewart Creek culvert that went under the railroad tracks, a quick 5-minute jog for the youngsters. The Creek of Death sounded much more foreign and exotic than Stewart Creek, so not a youth in Beechwood Acres knew the stream by its proper name. The wooded path was a path in name only. It is more like an obstacle course. To ward off the curious and hide its location, the trail was booby-trapped with countless bits of broken glass, and it was covered with more poison ivy than dirt. The trail remains hidden to this day. The path opened up on top of the cliff. Several neighborhood boys were there, and they gasped at the sight of Davy accompanying Chaz. Freckle-faced Preston Dino spoke excitedly. "Chaz, you're going to do it? You were the last kid to make the jump." Preston totally missed the double entendre. Chaz did not. From the top of the sandstone cliff, the briars were so overgrown and chock full of stickers, he could not even see the drop edge of yonder. His face was as white as a bleached sheet as he gaped at Davy, pondering whether he'd been better off with a good thrashing. Davy read his face. "Relax. Just remember to look at me the whole time, not the water." Looking at the water would have done Chaz no favors. It was an angry swirl of orange muddy mess, impossible to see through, like all southern streams. The cutting stones were not visible, but Chaz knew they were there, waiting, lurking. The neighborhood's 2 boxing brothers, Colin and Paul, broke his reverie. "Chaz, here, take the rope. Take a deep breath, count to 3, and jump out into the air as hard as you can. Don't look down." As Chaz slowly counted to 3 and foolhardily jumped into open space, the thought crossed his mind. How do I find that blessed 12-inch strip of sand if I do not look down? Fortunately, Davy did not have the sense that God gave a wet dish rag. He had stared in death's eye and spit over a dozen times, braving the Creek of Death several jumps a week. Davy knew exactly when to release the rope, and he could even tell from Chaz's wildly erratic, somewhat parabolic arc when to let go. Chaz was on his way back now, screaming absolute bloody murder. A dozen scruffy-looking boys in the cliff top chimed in for effect. Chaz shot Davy one terror-stricken glance as he twisted and contorted in open air. Davy quickly mouthed the word, "Now!" Chaz let go immediately and sailed downward, eyes closed as tightly as possible. He landed in a heap, miraculously dead center on the drop edge of yonder. He opened his eyes to the sight of a crawdad blankly staring at him from the water's edge. Davy had come through in the clutch, and Chaz was still on this side of the pearly gates. The neighborhood kids fairly flew down the cliffside and circumvented the brambles to cheer and congratulate Chaz. He was one of them now, just as certifiably crazy as a loon. As the unkempt mass of dirty boys deafened Chaz and smacked him on the shoulder, he unconsciously patted his pockets, and the horror struck. "Davy, my quarter from Grandpa Jake is gone. It must have dropped out when I was twisting on the rope." Chaz looked out over the swirling muddy water and gave that quarter up for dead. Davy quickly patted his pockets as well. "Jiminy cricket! My quarter is gone too. I must have lost it when we were tumbling down the embankment. How are we going to see Ghidra next Saturday with no money?" As bitter tears quickly arose, Preston jumped in. "I've got it. Davy, didn't you say that Mr. Grant traded you a dime for 6 empty bottles at his Wildwood Avenue store? Davy's voice quivered. Sure, but how does that help us, Prez? We have no bottles. Chaz and I turned them into Mr. Grant last month to buy the final issue of Mysteries of the Unexplored Worlds. Preston continued. It's 15 bottles for 2 bits. All we have to do is scour the countryside and collect 30 bottles before next Saturday's matinee. That's worth 2 quarters. Colin and I can cover Hoskins Road. Paul and Denny Mack can cover the path to Thomasboro Elementary. Chaz, Terry is sweet on you. You two can cover Reeves Court. And Davy, Cindy likes you, so you two can scour the back of the little general store up on Glenwood Drive. Genuinely blushing more than crying now, Davy and Chaz started to grin. All eyes were intently fixed on Preston. The North Charlotte knuckleheads had a mission. We all meet up next Saturday morning at 10 a.m. sharp at Mr. Grant's half-cent store. Mr. Grant's half-cent store was an imaginarium of sacred ground in North Charlotte. His little shop didn't have enough room to change your mind in, but it was the last store in North Charlotte to stock half-penny candy. Mr. Grant even sold candy soda pop in miniature wax bottles for 1 cent. He sold real soda pop for a dime. He was partial to mercury dimes. He proudly specialized in real balsa wood gliders for a nickel, and his pièce de résistance was his unparalleled comic book offerings. Chaz, Davy, and as many kids that could fit in Mr. Grant's store spent every early 1960s Saturday morning poring over such classics as Mysteries of the Unexplored Worlds, Mystery in Space with Adam Strange of Ran, and Journey into Mystery with the Asgardian Thor. Mystery was the leitmotif because it opened up whole new worlds to young, unjaded minds. Davy and Chaz would range for miles each weekend in search of precious glass bottles carelessly tossed onto roadsides. Just 6 old bottles and 2 Lincoln pennies served as the entrance fee into a 12-cent universe of possibilities. The ensuing 7 days flew by. The Beechwood Acres band of brothers and tomboys poured over acres of land in search of soda pop treasure. School interfered greatly with their quest during the week, but they hit the roadsides hard once the Thomasboro bell rang at the end of each day. Operating in independent search parties, no group knew how far along any other group was toward the 30-bottle threshold. Thus, all the groups converge on Mr. Grant's Imaginarium on an unsettled Saturday morning just before 10 a.m. Of course, Mr. Grant had advance intelligence on the whole affair. Chaz and Davy's Aunt Sis had slowly walked down to the store during the week to pass the word discreetly along to him. No one knew how old Aunt Sis really was, but Mr. Grant did know she had grown up as a little girl in the Old South during Reconstruction. Aunt Sis knew hard and poor like no other soul in North Charlotte. Secretly, Mr. Grant was pulling hard for Davy and Chaz. He cut his teeth on Doc Savage dime stories as a young lad in the 1930s. He still marveled that a man with no superpowers could fight so long and so hard against injustice in a Depression-era world personified by injustice. Mr. Grant's store instantly filled up at 10 a.m. Untidy and unkempt boys and girls presented filthy, dirty bottles on his lacquer wood countertop, one by one, as Mr. Grant quietly counted. He knew the magic number. Cindy and Davy put up the last treasure, a 7.5-ounce Coke bottle that was more dirt than bottle. It made 29. Before the wide-eyed street urchins surrounding him could finish counting on their hands and toes, Mr. Grant compassionately spoke. Young Master Davy, what is carbonated southern sunshine? Davy exploded. That's easy, Mr. Grant. Sundrop soda pop. You got it right, lad. And that is your reward. I just finished up a Sundrop, and here's my empty bottle. That makes 30 bottles and 2 shiny silver quarters. That old store erupted in a cacophony of cheers, cries, hoots, and hollers. Mr. Grant happily opened up his mechanical cash register and handed over 2 brand new quarters to Davy and Chaz. The boys jumped up and down like well-greased pogo sticks. There was just enough time for the whole group to trot the distance to the Belvedere Theater. Mr. Grant even closed up early for the first time in a quarter century. He wasn't going to miss this for anything. Mr. Skip was waiting for all of them at the ticket booth, dressed up in his Sunday best. During the past week, as the Beechwood Acres crew looked hither and yon for their roadside jewels, the movie buzz had spread like wildfire. Godzilla would battle Ghidra that upcoming Saturday, courtesy of Mr. Skip and his Belvedere Theater. Thus, a North Charlotte legion of youngsters descended upon the ticket booth well before noon. It would be the only time that the grand old lady would sell out all 460 seats. The air was electric with excitement. Mr. Skip was deeply moved by the spectacle and splendor of his first ever sellout. For the grand finale, even he watched all 85 minutes of high adventure. Godzilla, Rodan, and Mothra teamed up to whip Ghidorah and send him packing back to outer space, tail between his legs and 3 heads. As all 460 kids, Mr. Grant being the oldest, jumped up and applauded at the end of the 3-film matinee, it hit Mr. Skip. Godzilla had radioactive fire breath and several hundred feet in height on his side, but that was not enough. Until he teamed up with Rodan, Mothra, and a pair of 12-inch female fairies, he was no match for Ghidorah and his lightning breath times 3. The North Charlotte rowdies were just the same. When they traveled in singles at Thomasboro Elementary or on the way home from school, they were just fodder for any meanies, bullies, and teenagers that happened upon them. When they worked together as a team, they could accomplish most anything. That said, Southern Railway would prefer more constructive accomplishments than nearly derailing one of their trains. There was strength in size, but there was more strength in numbers. Unfortunately for Mr. Skip, he did not have long to ponder his revelation. Something had gone so horribly amiss. While he was lost in thought in his projection booth, the movie audience had left the theater to mill outside. But all 460 people were stone silent. There was no sound at all from his children. It was all wrong. Mr. Skip flew downstairs from his perch and burst outside in a matter of seconds. But there was no outside. Rather, there was nothing left outside. Where trees once stood, gaping muddy holes pockmarked the landscape. Uncounted lakes of dirty water were everywhere, and all the birds were gone. Where were the houses, the homes? Debris and clutter swirled around the theater like a discordant symphony. Cindy and Terry quietly sobbed as they viewed a house engulfed in flames in the distance, dangerously close to where their home should be. An F3 tornado had just laid waste the better portion of North Charlotte. Here and there, dazed and bruised people began slowly emerging into the eerie stillness to survey the wreckage. But they were dazed and bruised adults, each and every one of them. All the North Charlotte children were safe and sound, standing in a huge cluster around Mr. Skip. He looked up at the Belvedere's gleaming white plaster facade. Not so much as a fleck was missing. He ran his hands slowly along the outside of the building. It was dry to the touch. It was a miracle. Mr. Skip quietly whistled and spoke as he looked up with tears in his eyes. "Old girl, you and the big guy did yourselves proud on this long day." The grand old lady just looked down and smiled. The end.